Thought for this year's Christmas video, I would tell a story. I've been a storyteller in one way or another for most of my life. The first stories I ever told in primary school to the class, I was probably just 9 or 10 years old. And I still tell stories now, 60 years later. And for this story, which is a sort of mixture of fact and just a little bit of fiction, as all good stories are, I want to go back 60 years to that time, actually, in Wales, when I was growing up in Wales. And our family home was right next to a woodland. And the woodland was a very important part of my childhood. It provided a lot of the joy, some of the terror as well, but mostly joy, a kind of place of freedom. There was no health and safety in those days, so I climbed trees along with my friends and my brothers and enjoyed life in a very free and easy way. Anyway, I want to take you back to 1963. And in the summer and autumn of that year, a rather tragic thing happened, which was that the wood was cut down, or most of the wood was cut down. It was a deciduous woodland, and it was decided by the wise people of those days that they wanted a pine wood for pit props for the collieries, which were many and various at that time in South Wales. So, without consulting any of the villagers, without consulting our family, they proceeded to cut down the wood uh, and laid the wood waste. And it was incredibly tragic for us, but we were powerless. Anyway, I want to take you now to the winter of 1963, which was a very cold winter, which is unusual in South Wales because we're part of the Gulf Stream area. The Gulf Stream flows up towards South Wales, so not much snow ever fell. But that year, 1963, it was very cold and the snow did fall. And as we came up to Christmas time, we were obviously thinking of decorating the house. And we were also walking the woodland, and that woodland was now bare and snowy, and we could see the Garth Mountain, which was our wonderful mountain, in a way that we'd never seen it before because there were no trees to hide it. But one day when we were walking the woodland, this bare woodland covered with snow, it was a strange sight. It was like a bare moorland, I suppose, except that you could see little trunks of trees where they cut the trees. Anyway, we arrived at a little brook which we hadn't really been able to visit in the same way before ever, because the brook was normally hidden by the trees. Anyway, we arrived at this brook, and there, in the bank of the brook, we saw a rather strange sight. It was a small sapling, and it was a larch sapling, which had survived the massacre of trees. It was very small, so obviously they had no reason to cut it down. But what was so strange was it was larch, and most of the woodland was deciduous. And in the landscape of snow, it looked amazing, and it looked like a little Christmas tree there in the middle of the woodland. So my brother and I thought, why don't we take this larch tree and make it our Christmas tree this year? Wouldn't that be wonderful? So we got a wheelbarrow and a spade, and we returned to the spot later in the day. And we dug up this sapling, this little tree, this larch tree, this beautiful tree we'd found in the snow. And we very carefully returned it home. And we found a little flower pot and put it in the flower pot, and then eventually put it in our sitting room at home. And obviously our parents were there with us. And we looked at this tree and we were dismayed, because once the tree was inside the house, it looked completely different. It wasn't really a Christmas tree at all. It was a larch. It was spindly. And because it had been growing in a bank, it was sort of bent. It was searching the light when it was growing up on this bank. And so it really was not straight. It was straight. It was spindly. It was big. It was much bigger than we thought. And it sort of dominated the room. And we quickly realized that this could not be our Christmas tree. So we thought to ourselves, well, what should we do with this tree? And we decided we returned it to the wood. So we took it out of the flower pot and we put it in the wheelbarrow, and we went with the wheelbarrow back to the spot, and we tried to plant it back where it was. It wasn't so easy because, of course, it was well rooted when we dug it out of the earth in the bank, and the bank was quite steep next to the brook. So we found it quite hard to sort of plant it again in the bank. But eventually it was there in the bank, looking a bit sad, I have to say. It had obviously spent a couple of days out of its roots. It had spent a day in the dark of our sitting room before we finally made that decision to return it to the wood. So it looked rather pathetic, and we kind of stared at it and thought, oh gosh, will it survive? Well, the story is that I never went back to that spot. I couldn't face the fact in later years as I was growing up. I couldn't face the fact of seeing it dead, or, that we'd destroyed this tree in our great mission to create a Christmas tree. We'd actually destroyed this tree and become part of the destruction of the woodland. So I never visited it again. And of course, I then forgot about it and grew up and came to live in London, and the decades go by. And many years later, I went back to Wales, not so long ago, in the last decade or two, by which time the pine trees had grown right up. It was a pine forest. Of course, it had never got cut down for pit props because the pit props were no longer needed. So this great dark pine forest was where the deciduous woodland was. A very different place, very quiet, very dark, very few birds, very little vegetation. And as you wandered through this pine forest, you could see odd trunks, the old deciduous trunks which had been left there. Most of them had been cleared away, but the occasional trunk you would see, which was testimony to that previous woodland. Anyway, I thought to myself as I was walking along, I thought, I should really have a look for that larch tree and see if it's still there. So I went and eventually found the brook, which was looking very different under the pine trees. It was still trickling away from the mountain. Of course, it was water from the mountain. And I followed the brook down. It was quite hard to get the geography right because, of course, the pine trees made everything different. And I didn't find the larch tree. I walked up and down and walked up and down. And I didn't find it. And then I was just kind of standing there for a moment thinking, oh, that's a pity. When I suddenly realized I was standing right next to this trunk, which was not quite as straight as the other trunks. And I thought, oh gosh, this is the larch tree. Of course, 60 years had rather changed the nature of this larch tree, although I was sort of adult enough to realize it would have changed in 60 years. I hadn't quite realized how big it would be. I was still in my mind looking for a sapling, I suppose. And I suddenly realized that this trunk that I was looking at right next to me was the larch tree. And of course, it was hidden in a way because it was amongst its friends, the pines. It wasn't a pine, it was a larch. But it was there in its coniferous friends, and I hadn't noticed it. So I suppose when I went home that day, I thought, well, we didn't quite fail that year. We failed to find a Christmas tree that satisfied us, but we did go back to the woodland and we did replant it, albeit rather ham-fistedly, but it did survive. And there it is, the larch in the woodland. And that's my story from 1963, my Christmas story for 2024. And I wish you a very happy Christmas, all of you.